welcome everyone. I'm Marie Diener-West from the Master of Public Health program, and I would like to welcome you and thank you for being here today. As I think you all know, this is one of the events of a series of events that are being sponsored by the students of our school to both continue the awareness, the concern, and the efforts for what is going on in Haiti. And this is a very special event of the sequence of events because, as you all know, this includes hearing from the experiences of our 4 MPH students who were in Haiti and who continue to be committed to that country. This started off as these 4 students receiving an MPH Field Experience Award to go to do an important public health thing, which was to look at iodization of salt in this country. And they certainly were then challenged with a challenge that most of us in our lifetimes never experience, and really rose to that challenge, and we're extremely proud of them. So today's program is one in which I'd like to first introduce our dean, Mike Clegg, who will say some words. We'll then have an introduction given by Dr. Court Robinson, who's from the Department of International Health, who has also risen to the challenges of working in such areas. He's affiliated with the Center for Refugee and Disaster Response. And then it will be an informal discussion, and you'll hear much, much more about the efforts that are underway. So I'd like to introduce somebody who needs no introduction, Dean Mike Clegg.
Thank you, Maria. Thanks. You know, so most of you weren't here when I became dean. I became dean 2 days after Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans, and then that's how I met Court and met Gilbert, and ended up being down there in Houston working in shelters a week or so later. I was in Hurricane Agnes, and I was evacuated from my house. It's a long story, but you know, off the rooftop, boat, things like that, and saw my town under martial law, and couldn't drink the water, and you know, raw sewage everywhere. So I've had some little experience with being in disasters, but I can't imagine what you guys went through. You know, I think, you know, I learned about it through email. I was really happy with the way that Marie and Mike Ward and others responded to get you here, get you back home safely. You know, we always brag that we're in 120 countries. You know, we're proud of that we work around the world and we work with vulnerable populations. And, you know, it's fun. But when things like this happen, it makes me realize that it comes with a commitment that commitment to do the right thing for people often sometimes puts us in harm's way. So I'm very, I guess this is an official welcome back from the administration of the school, but we're happy that you came back. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and we're proud of you and all our students. Court.
Thank you. Welcome. Just want to say another thank you to the MPH program and Marie Diener-West for her leadership in organizing this and helping to facilitate the Travel Experience Awards, which got them to this place in the first place, although they ended up doing different sorts of things. To the dean, whose leadership has always been clear in all sorts of endeavors, but I think for those of us who are involved in refugees and disasters, you kind of put your money where your mouth is and you walk the walk instead of, in addition to talking the talk. So we're pleased to welcome you here and to thank you for your ongoing support. My colleagues at the Center for Refugee and Disaster Response, Director Gilbert Burnham, Shannon Ducey, anyone else who's out there, we continue to do what we can to be on the ground. We have a team down there. Tom Kirsch, co-director of the center, is there leading a clinical team, and I'll, if time permits, read a few notes from the field that he sent in. But really this is about acknowledging 4 of our students and more who are out there, and hope we'll have a chance after their presentation to learn about what they experienced, to learn about what they intend to do, and I'm sure will do, knowing their commitment, and what all of you, students, faculty alike, can do to continue to not just keep the Haitian people in our hearts, but also take action. and bring whatever skills we have as clinicians, as public health practitioners, as advocates for a rebuilding. Build back better is the mantra that we use. How do we do that for Haiti? So just a few introductory remarks. The name Haiti comes from the Taino Indian dialect for a word meaning land of high mountains. It was colonized by the Spanish and then by the French. Became one of the wealthier countries in the Caribbean, thanks largely to the large-scale importation of African slaves to work in the forests and cane plantations. 1804, a slave uprising led by Toussaint Louverture created out of Haiti the first independent nation in Latin America and the first black-led republic in the world. History has not been kind to Haiti since then, leading a poet and historian, Jean-Claude Martineau, to say in 2006, Haiti is the only country in the world with a last name. It reads Haiti, poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And practically every media outlet that you look at, you will see that exact phrase, Haiti, poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. So this is a sudden crisis for sure, but it's also a crisis on top of an evolving long-term crisis affecting the health, affecting society, culture, economy, etc. So even before the earthquake, Haiti was 149 out of 182 countries on the UN Human Development Index. 55% of its 9.7 million population live on less than $1 per day. Half lacked access to safe water and basic health care. Life expectancy about 60 years. Infant mortality around 60 deaths per 1,000 live births. Under 5 mortality about double that. Median age around 20. More than 2.4 million Haitians are food insecure, and half of all food consumed is imported, much of it by relief and development organizations, giving Haiti another of its names, the Republic of NGOs. A country one might say, at least in more effective ways, by international organizations. An important point to remember and think about as we think about the ongoing response. WHO wrote, hospital and clinical facilities, again, pre-earthquake, have long been compromised by infrastructural deficiencies, electrical blackouts, water problems, and general impoverishment. Then on January 12, 4:53 p.m. local time, an earthquake of 7.0 on the Richter scale hit Haiti with an epicenter only 17 kilometers from the capital of Port-au-Prince with a population of about 2 million people. 150,000, I would say, confirmed dead. We could see numbers easily double that as the ongoing direct effects of the earthquakes are felt, with injuries and people succumbing to deprivation that follows. 3.5 million people affected, easily 1 million homeless, homes, buildings leveled with all aspects of critical infrastructure, power, water, sanitation, transport, communication, health, government itself collapsed or heavily damaged. This may prove to be one of history's greatest disasters happening to a country in desperate conditions to begin with. So that same day, 4 of our MPH students, in alphabetical order, Jane Andrews, Remley Stubbs-Dame, Lalita Suprapaneni, and Andrew Tyan were there in Haiti, and as Marie mentioned, doing something somewhat different. They were going to be studying iodine deficiency under the supervision of Keith West, with support from the MPH program's Field Experience Fund Award. I was on that review committee, and I checked my notes, and it said, very strong proposal, a bit ambitious for the time frame, but mostly doable. They were, one might say, in the wrong place at the wrong time, but I think, as you will hear, they did the right thing, and they had the right stuff in the face of extraordinary chaos and suffering. So this event, sponsored by the MPH Office, Center for Refugee and Disaster Response, is an opportunity really to hear your experiences and to talk about not only what they plan to do, you plan to do, but what we as a school can and will do. So I'm going to turn it over to them. Following that, ask them to talk a little bit about next steps, and then we'll open it up to the floor for anyone representing a student group or an individual interest to talk about what you're doing, and then maybe more generally questions and comments, and we'll try to wrap it all up by 1:20. So thank you. I'll turn it over to you now.
So I'm talking first. I'm actually going to go mobile because I feel a little bit better getting a little closer to you. But as mentioned, my name is Remley, and I was one of those 4 students. We're being tapped to kind of give you our eyewitness on-the-ground feel, so I'll try to do that. So we went to Haiti on January 2nd as part of this fantastic grant that our wonderful administration so graciously bequeathed to us. And we were studying iodine deficiency disorders. So iodine deficiency in a population that has it moderately or severely is responsible for about a 14 percentage point IQ lowering. That's huge. And in Haiti, there is either moderate or high deficiency in 90% of rural areas and 50% of urban areas. I mean, that's an intellectual capital issue that Haiti just cannot afford to lose. And internationally, iodine deficiency has been a big priority in the last 10 or 15 years. UNICEF has really been spearheading a lot of campaigns to get this done. India's done a fantastic job. Guatemala's done a great job. Dominican Republic started one in 2005. Amidst all of the other issues in Haiti, momentum has been very difficult to build. So we were there trying to give UNICEF and the government and a couple other smaller NGOs some of the crude data and information that they would need to really fuel an effective campaign to iodize salt and to improve iodine levels in the population. We were doing pretty well. We were looking at both the producer and the consumer side, and some of my colleagues will tell you a little bit more about the research we were doing. And then January 12th happened, which is also my birthday, ironically. And Haiti changed, our research changed, and my life changed profoundly. When the actual earthquake happened, both I and Lalita were 2 hours north of Port-au-Prince, and our other two lovely members were actually 6 hours north of Port-au-Prince in our respective areas. When the earthquake happened, Lalita and I were riding in what's called a tap-tap, which is a pickup truck with 2 wooden benches in the back, and then as many people smushed in as is humanly possible. And the shocks and the roads are so terrible, we actually didn't feel the earthquake, even though the magnitude was quite large in our area. No idea it happened. 2 hours later, somebody finally got through to our terrible Creole and told us that a lot of people had died in Port-au-Prince. At about 11 p.m. that night, we heard frantic calling outside of our hotel room because Andy and Jane didn't know that we were okay. There was, at that point, no power in the entire country, no cell phone reception, with very few exceptions, and no internet. So there was a complete communication blackout, and they didn't know how far the earthquake had extended. We also didn't know that there was also a tsunami warning, which was really freaking our parents out, but happily we were totally oblivious of that. When we came and found our group, they told us that they had gotten a call, miraculously, from one of the people who was staying with them, that his wife had been trapped in the rubble. She was in a very small air pocket. Her entire building had collapsed on her and 2 staff members, and she needed him to come dig her out. That's an incredible call to get when you're 6 hours away. You can't imagine the magnitude. And when he told me, initially I said, "You mean like something fell on her gate? She's trapped in her house?" He said, "No, she's trapped in the house. The entire house collapsed." So we threw things in bags pretty quickly, trying to throw in rum and Band-Aids and bandanas, anything we thought might be useful for emergency medicine, and hurtled down. And the drive down was one of the most surreal and beautiful and terrible experiences of my life. There were 10 people in this pickup truck, and one of them actually had already found out that 2 of his daughters were in a school that collapsed and they hadn't come out. So probably 2 of his daughters were dead. And then an additional 3 people in the truck didn't know where their families were and were getting a ride down from this province to try and find their families. And then we were there, and we were sitting in the back of the pickup truck, and as you're driving down, the power is out for the entire country, and everywhere people have lit fires. I don't know if it's a need for human connection or a memorial, but tires were burning, trees were burning, there were just fires along the roadside, and some of them were manned and some of them weren't. But it was sort of like an eerie lit avenue getting to Port-au-Prince. And when we actually got to Port-au-Prince, my first kind of real experience of the earthquake was coming into a traffic intersection of the main highways that enter Port-au-Prince. And there's a statue there of 2 hands holding the world. Statue's about half the size of this stage. And all around the statue, everybody who lived in the area had gathered. And they were singing really loudly and clapping call and response songs of joy and praise for being alive. And it was just the most palpable sense of community I've ever experienced. And as we proceeded to go deeper into Port-au-Prince, into the more affected areas, there would be dead interspersed in these groups of singing people. But the singing would continue. And you couldn't tell whose dead they were, because everybody was holding each other and singing, because it was everyone's dead. And it was a truly indescribable experience. But that kind of palpable sense of community persisted the 4 days that I was there. So I know that on the state side you read about looting and violence, and I think that there's a certain story that gets told in the media a lot about dangerous Haiti. You know, it's a very saleable, I don't think that's a word, commodity. And when I was there, I didn't see looting, I didn't see a single episode of violence, I didn't see a single episode of unkind words from one person to another. You know, I saw a lot of despair and a lot of hope and an incredible grace under pressure. So another one of my major memories was seeing teams of teenagers from 12, that kind of super stringy in-between look, to 18 to, you know, slightly more than teenagers, who had organized themselves into search parties and were going systematically from house to house, knocking on the concrete to see if anybody knocked back. And then, if somebody did, pulling the concrete off with their bare hands, finding things to use as chisels because there were no tools. They didn't have masks. I know that all of us who were in the MPH program heard about World Trade Center dust and the terrible things that that does to you long term. There was an incredible amount of dust in the air from really terrible construction that had completely pulverized an entire city's worth of dust. And these people were working through that the entire time we were there. It was an incredibly moving experience. While I was there, I also did kind of a rapid assessment, so you'll be pleased to use what you'll be pleased to know that what you are learning in graduate school is useful. I was like, heck, I am getting a return on my investment halfway through. So I went out and I initially planned this wonderful cluster sampling in 5 house groups, and it was going to be very what we ended up doing was going to conglomerations of people. So the area that I went to was called Delmas, actually Delmas 33, and it's a very poor area, and about 75% of the buildings had fallen. And of the buildings that hadn't fallen, an additional, I would say, 15% were structurally inhabitable. So everybody was sleeping in the streets, as were we. And they had all kind of grouped into communities of between 10 and 35 people. And they would communally clear an area of rubble and set up whatever tarps they had and cook whatever food they had. And so we ended up interviewing about 850 of these people in a small survey team that I helped organize, and with a very basic survey to get an idea of mortality rate, which was about 10%, rate of serious injury without being treated, which is about 6%, how many children there were, so we saw about 35% of these people were children. There were a lot of kids. And food and water availability. And everybody I talked to was on their last day of food and their last day of water. And this was on January 15th, I think. So you can imagine it took another good week to even get any World Food Program resources effectively distributed, and they still haven't gotten to all the people who needed it. So the kind of levels of desperation were mounting as I was out there. I also visited 2 refugee camps, one of which was about 2,000 people, and one of which was about 13,000 people. And in the 2,000-person refugee camp, there was somebody who had organized this camp. And he led me around, and he showed me the location of every sick person. He said, we have 424 people who need medical care. We have 43 of those people who desperately need hospital care. I need this list of antibiotics, and I need food, and I need water. There was not a drop of potable water in this camp of 2,000 people. And I said, great, I'm going to take this data, I'm going to try and give it to the World Food Program to let them know. But simultaneously, I knew that this data might not go anywhere. And that was a pretty crushing feeling. And kind of over the course of the experience, we saw a lot of truly miraculous things, which you'll hear about, and a lot of truly terrible things, which you'll also hear about. But I came out with sort of 3 main career-changing ideas, I guess. And one of them was, it impressed upon me the importance of organization. So when you take out email systems, phone systems, any sort of power, it creates this incredible vacuum of order. And not to mention, when the head of the UN dies and all of the important government buildings collapse, the kind of vacuum that's left is really hard to work in. And I didn't feel like initially in the beginning days, the international community helped. So everybody would ask us for supplies, and we didn't have any to give, nor did we know when they were coming in. And when we found out that working in our clinic, we had no supplies, but there were supplies sitting in the airport which were not being distributed, it was a pretty terrible feeling. And when we actually got to the airport, we saw body-sniffing dogs in cages on the tarmac because they hadn't been given security clearance to leave, which was pretty infuriating because if you think about it, people will rush food. People will rush water. If I have a 2-year-old, she's starving, I'll take that from you. No one is going to rush teams of searchers and dogs because they know what they're doing. And it, to me, felt like a fundamental lack of trust in the rationality of the Haitian people, and I found that to be pretty egregious. So, number one, thinking about administration, making really smart choices, and allowing people to have the tools to help themselves. Number two, importance of maternal and child health. So in these camps where I was, children had started to get a listless look. There was a lot of lying down. They didn't have a lot of calories that they were moving on. And it was clear that the diarrheal diseases were about to start really flaring up. When we left kind of on that verge, but sanitation, not so hot. And you could see almost immediately that the nutritional impact of this event was going to have developmental effects on an entire generation of Haitians. Not only not having food right now, but the nutritional content of the emergency relief rice and beans that they're going to be getting. And that to me was pretty profound, that you have this small moment in time, and your inaction or incorrect action could affect this country for the next 25 years, or however many years these people are in productive working form. So that was pretty profound. Then the third piece was the, well, heck, I've forgotten the third piece. Point being, this was an incredibly profound experience, and I'm hoping that our experience can help other people feel a personal connection to Haiti and to long-term involved action in strategically building the next building block.
So I'm just going to sit here because that's easier on my body. It's just kind of park here, and if you don't mind, I have a little cheat sheet that I'd like to refer to as I talk. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about, give you a little bit of a more detailed picture about our research, and then maybe just give you a couple of details about the medical work that we did for the couple of days that we were there. So as Dr. Robinson mentioned, Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and coincidentally, actually perhaps not coincidentally, Haiti also has one of the hardest times holding on to its intellectual capital. You know, there's innumerable reasons that you could list for why this is so, but I'm just going to mention two for you, and then go from there. One is brain drain. Everyone knows the term brain drain. It's very talked about. It's a very hot topic, I guess, sometimes when you talk about development and barriers to development. For Haiti, if you receive past a high school level of education, there's less than a 20% chance that you'll end up participating in your country's skilled workforce, and that's a pretty significant number. You know, when you talk about brain drain, you can't look at it as a closed problem. There's, you know, a lot of things you have to consider, like an individual's right to migration, and I'm not proposing any solutions, but just to say that you know, this is something that, you know, unquestionably affects the development of the country. You have things like remittances, but you know, needless to say, it is an issue. And so the first thing that I wanted to talk about was brain drain, and just to mention that, and to compare that to iodine deficiency disorders, because I think of iodine deficiency disorders as a domestic source of brain drain. No one's getting remittances if you, have a less intelligent, I guess, population. Iodine deficiency disorders is estimated to take a toll of around 1 billion IQ points globally. Remley gave you some statistics about Haiti, but I guess if you had to take away one, you could just remember the number 60%. About 60% of the country is iodine deficient. So one of the statistics that correlates the IQ with that is if you measure the urinary iodine concentration and you have less than 100 micrograms per liter of iodine in your urine, you're considered to have some level of iodine deficiency. And mild to moderate iodine deficiency is correlated with about a 10 to 15 IQ point drop. Along those lines, a severe form of iodine deficiency is known as cretinism, and it's estimated about 30,000 people in Haiti annually are afflicted with cretinism because of this. There's this concept called the Flynn effect, and it's a recently coined term, and what it refers to is kind of this phenomenon that people have observed over different countries, different communities, where with each successive generation, it seems like the population does better on IQ metrics, like they score more intelligently. And people have proposed a lot of different reasons for this. Is it something about family systems? Is it something about the availability of education? And regardless, needless to say, one of the contributors is undoubtedly iodine deficiency, or actually the addressing of iodine deficiency. So I wanted to ask, for you personally, we all have some level of self-awareness in terms of our IQ, but where would you be without 15 IQ points? 15 IQ points is a standard deviation. Would you be sitting in this room? Would you be be able to pursue the same things that you're pursuing now? In a country where more than half of the population has to deal with this, your odds are, not as good as a coin toss. Undoubtedly there are some among us like Dr. Diener West who probably could afford to still be here with and be teaching our statistics class, but I definitely could say for myself. The term is not yet over. So. But I can undoubtedly speak for myself in saying that, I'm grateful that, growing up I didn't realize that iodized salt, that I needed to be consuming iodized salt, but we had a structure in place to where I did not have to be vulnerable to those risks. And so, we decided to work on iodine deficiency disorders, and we had a contact through UNICEF, who was also a former fellow of Dr. Keith West. And when a door of opportunity presents itself, you should definitely walk through. We divided up our research objectives based on some of the on-the-ground reports of what are the main barriers and to iodine, supplementation, iodine, salt iodization, and we were ambitious, but we wanted to look at the barriers from the salt producer level and the barriers in the household level, and also, I guess, the barriers in the household level, specifically culturally. There's phenomenon, there's practices known as salt washing, because the quality of salt is not aesthetically as good as what we're used to. It's very common to see people wash salt before they use it in their house to get rid of impurities, debris and issues like that. Jane and I did research specifically in the area of working with the salt producers, because in order for salt to be iodizable, it needs to meet certain purity standards. magnesium, if you ever go to the store and you try to buy sea salt, you'll notice that it has more magnesium than regular salt. And the magnesium is a hygroscopic, water-attracting element, and it impedes proper salt iodization. And so we wanted to work with them and to really understand what they were up against, and we developed a questionnaire to do so. Needless to say, we were in the process of doing this, and on January 12th, Jane and I were standing on a mountain in Communance Rouge, and we were learning about a reforestation project that this NGO Amert had been undertaking, and they were using moringa, which is a very popular plant in development circles. It has a plethora of uses, and we were standing on the mountain with the moringa growing, and someone was talking, and we all noticed that the ground was shaking a little bit, and didn't think anything too much of it at the time. The community that we were in, they have hot springs, and I think like about 40 years ago, they had a volcano erupt close to where we were. Actually, one of the locals pointed to the mountain that it happened on, and so we were like, okay, small earthquake, no big deal. That's kind of cool. And it was only until an hour or two later that we heard that the epicenter was in Port-au-Prince and that the damages were catastrophic. And at that point, we made the decision to go down with the other team, the NGO, and to check up on our teammates, Remley and Lalita. You heard some vignettes of, or some pictures of what things look like on the ground, and I won't go into them now, but just to give you a rundown of kind of what we experienced on the ground. You have read the news reports. You have heard about the need for antibiotics and the need for pain control and the need for proper surgical equipment, and also the long-term needs in terms of where are these amputees, where are they going to recover, where are we going to get the dialysis machines to support those who sustained crush injuries, I just wanted to say, one of the feelings that we had on the ground was, as alluded to by Remley, was this sense of lack of a reference point. The fact that we didn't have communication was very unsettling. We had a very, I personally had a very temperamental response to situations because you just had a hard time understanding the big picture. But anyway, I won't go on, and I'll pass it on to Lalita.
Hi. Hi, I'm Lalita. My part of the research project was to do a household survey on knowledge of iodine and this practice called salt washing and some social marketing issues in this village called Ponsonde. So we got to Haiti on January 2nd, and I loved Haiti, absolutely, from the first sight. The warm sun was very welcome after the snow in Baltimore, and the plantain trees and the beaches and the mountains. And some of the things did remind me of India, like the buses that were filled to double the capacity. And yeah, and so we started our research and we're making progress. Everything was going pretty much according to schedule until January 12th. And yeah, so I just wanted to share this one anecdote. On the first day in Ponsonde, I managed to get myself locked out in the middle of the night with no phone, no money, and I didn't speak the language. So I was scared. All of those stories, like Remley was saying about how dangerous Haiti is, they were slowly coming back to me. But then I talked to some random person on the street because I had to get into the house, and he was super nice. He used his own phone minutes to make some calls and find out who had the keys to the place, and then everybody in the village came and then helped us and let us in. And so I felt really safe and I felt at home. And then on January 12th, when we went to Port-au-Prince, from then to Saturday, the 19th when we left, all of my experiences are in this snapshot memories that I still have to piece together, and I have to process them because it was just so overwhelming, and I didn't have the emotional strength to deal with it at the time because I had to do the medical side of it. I remember from my first night, we had a group of 10 people in the pickup truck, and we were just dropping people off at their homes. And so while we were walking on the street, there was a father of 3 girls, and he asked us to help him dig out his daughters who were trapped under the rubble for 5 hours, and one of the daughters was growing unresponsive. But there was nothing we could do because we had to go on and help the woman who was trapped under the rubble of Norwich Mission House. And I remember walking through the streets. There was shrouded figure of a baby that was tied to a plank, and it was abandoned on the side of the street. A crane loader that was scooping up dead bodies from the street. And the cries of the patients that I had to attend to because there was no anesthesia. And I remember this one girl, she was about my age, and she had a wound that was revealing a shattered knee, and we had to clean it because there was like dust and cement and everything mixed up with the blood, and we had no anesthesia except extra strength Brufen, I guess. And so Jane had this idea, and then we gave her some rum. She used to scream in pain and then pass out and then start screaming again. I also remember the prayer songs that everybody used to sing at night. It was just so incredible that these people had so much strength. Like, they've lost their families, and some of them didn't know if they were alive or not, and they lost their homes, and they were injured and needed surgery. But all of them would like at night, they would just come together and sing and pray to God. And as everybody experienced it, it was an incredible sense of community. At this one place called Matthew 25, there was this little girl of 10 years. Her jaw was broken. She lost her mom a couple of months before the earthquake, and she had some lacerations which I had to clean and then try and sew up. This was by far the most hardest experience as a doctor I've had. As I was trying to like pull her arm and then try and clean the wound, she was crying, and so this nurse was trying to distract her, and she was singing a song in Spanish with this tone, what they call having a tear in the voice. And the girl was like tugging at my chin, begging me to stop because she was in so much pain. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't cry because I had to do my job. I couldn't say any words of comfort to her, not even empty ones, because I didn't speak Creole. Yeah, it's been really difficult. And after I got back, people asked me, is your mom going to let you get on a plane to Haiti again? And do you want to go back? Yes, I do want to go back, but I mean, the earthquake has tied me to Haiti in more ways than I could articulate. But I made this decision to go back when I was doing my surveys in Ponsonde. I talked to 32 households. Of them, only one of them knew what iodine was, and she was a trained nurse. But I remember going to all these houses. They were like babies, neonates, they were pregnant women, they were young kids, and I just remember being so frustrated, and I was like, I'm gonna come back and make sure everybody in Haiti has iodine. It was childish, but public health spirit nonetheless. So now when I think of Haiti and going back, it's surprisingly, it's not the images of destruction that come back to me. It's these wonderful group of kids that used to come and play with us at the clinic. So Ramli and I had this English Creole school. She used to teach them English, and they used to teach us Creole. So it's those children, their laugh and their love and the 10 to 15 IQ points that they're missing that pulls me back to Haiti.
So
I guess I'm the last one, and I was just going to bring up a couple themes to some of my memories. The one thing that keeps coming back when I think about the stories and things that I remember is that the Haitians were and still are the first and best rescue workers that are in Haiti. And they're not the humanitarian tourists, and they're still there, and they don't get relieved every 2 weeks. And this is, I think it's, I hate to make generalizations because I was only there a short time, but it seemed to me different than other developing countries I had been in. Even in Souchaude, where we were for before the earthquake, there was this. There was a spirit of volunteerism in the community that was impressive. There was one particular woman I remember who did family planning, and she had been trained 12 years ago by an NGO to do family planning, and for 12 years now, the project ended after a year, but for the last 11 years without pay, she's been, for every woman in that village and surrounding villages, she counsels them when they get pregnant, she counsels them through their pregnancy, she visits, every woman sees, they know who she is, and she provides that service for her community. So, and that was the same thing that we saw after the earthquake too. I remember going when we were at the Prime Minister's, so there was a big refugee camp set up around the Prime Minister's house, and sort of up around where you would park the cars, like around where the gravel surface was, they had set up a medical clinic where we spent one afternoon. And we were 5 with us, Andy, Lalita, and myself, and 2 Haitians, and there were a team of 8 Chinese doctors there. And when we approached, immediately a Haitian doctor recognized one of our Haitian counterparts, welcomed us in, and we walked into this scene of many Haitian doctors, nurses, residents, anyone that knew how to put on gloves and do anything, had just sort of organized themselves, and there was someone with a clipboard, and they said, what skills do you have? Work over here. And so it was just sort of a conglomeration of all these Haitians, a few Chinese, and us. And this was on day 2, I think. And so when we left, I just remember a professional-looking Haitian man. He still had his belt on and his business shirt, and he kind of shook our hands, and he said, "Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for coming," as if to say, to me, it felt like, like I'm still working. Thanks for coming. Like you can go. Like these are my people. I'm not leaving. Like you're welcome to visit and help whenever you can, but it's my job. We really appreciate your part, your 3-hour contribution or whatever. So, and then also at Matthew 25, there were probably 15 20 to 35-year-old men that on night 1 of the earthquake, there's a soccer field behind the house, and it's these guys apparently organized soccer tournaments, and they had all donned their green soccer uniforms and green hats and organized the refugee camp of 1,500 people, and they had decided where the latrines were, and they had made a clinic center in the middle, and everyone, when they saw the green shirts and green hats, they knew where to go for help. And so these guys were carrying the sick in on mattresses and carrying the sick out. They walked them down the street to the hospitals. And when we came in, they took our hands and walked us. They found Lalita was a doctor, and they walked us around and wanted to show us every single sick patient. They knew in which tents they were, and so I was just completely floored by how amazing the Haitian relief workers were. There's one miracle story that there's several there are lots of miracles, but one, when we got to Matthew 25, a man who works with development, he's a Haitian. He has a home for developmentally disabled children in Haiti, and I think he has maybe 15 to 20 children there. He said that everyone in his house had lived, including his 2-year-old daughter, because when the earthquake happened, the caretaker and the daughter were sleeping upstairs. This was 4:45 p.m., and the caretaker heard somebody call her name and wake her up. And so she picked up the 2-year-old, walked downstairs, walked out of the house into the yard, and took some of the children with her. And then the earthquake happened, the whole house collapsed, and everybody denies having called her name, and nobody was there. So there's just kind of like moments of truth. And so we spent a lot of nights sort of strategically sleeping and trying to arrange the beds that you're 6 feet from the 6-foot wall in case it goes that way, and so the house in case it goes that way, just kind of making your bed just so. But you would, I think that Lalita's comment about the singing was just so true, because when we were at Didi's house the first couple nights, they meditate and do kirtan singing every night, and that was really moving. For me personally, I think it was just like a lesson in stress relief for people doing relief work. And then also when we were at Matthew 25, I went to bed at 9 and woke up at 11:30 because there was just this really loud music going on in the refugee camp behind the wall. And some of the Haitians who'd come with us from Souchaude were joining in. So I guess my last comment, just that my dad got back from Haiti this morning. He left 2 days after I came back with the DMAT Ohio 5 team. They have U.S. doctors going over there for 2-week stints to help. And he said that he felt a sense of hope coming after the 2 weeks, and it looked a lot better than when he went in. He said the airport was a lot less crowded. They had immigration people there. He saw charcoal moving up and down the street. The banks, people were in lines at the banks, which is a miracle. They had people in lines at Western Unions that were all open. He had seen money being exchanged. So, and that people generally had a sense of hope that there was aid coming in. And so, I don't know, and the tent city across from the airport looked a lot better than when he came in 2 weeks ago. And so that's, just, I don't know, there's a sense of positive attitude in the air. And then as a public health student, I just feel, I think over the last 2 weeks being here, I felt sort of increasing sense of anger a little bit about, like, we came in doing long-term development work and we left doing emergency work. And I sort of feel angry that Haiti got to this point where it had to have this happen, because we've known for forever that there are 7 geological fault lines running through this tiny itty-bitty country. There are 2 million people living in Port-au-Prince, and we knew that they were building their houses without enough rebar. We knew that they're making their cement with salt water. And we knew that these homes wouldn't withstand something that was inevitable with 7 fault lines there. And so to me, it's also just a tragedy of putting a country in where their systems aren't able to support them. And so I guess I'm sort of trying to channel my anger, and maybe we can all do this, is we're a school of preventative health, and how can we look at not only rebuilding Haiti sustainably, but creating world systems that allow countries to not be in this situation. So.
Thank you all for very personal and very powerful statements, and I know there are many questions and comments, but you had asked if you could talk a bit about what do you see as next for yourselves and possibly a challenge for us and more broadly in the school and beyond. So it's now 1:07. We have till 1:20, so I'm going to leave it to you all to just manage that time, and hopefully we will have some time for some Q&A and other comments from the audience. Anyone?
Sure. So we've sort of organized a crack team. We're tentatively labeling the Hopkins Haiti Consortium, because we're not a student organization. No paperwork. But what we are is sort of a coalition of the different student organizations and any interested students. We've begun meeting on Wednesdays at lunchtime. Anyone and everyone is welcome to come. But what we're trying to do is have a forum to maximize our impact, so that as we are planning events with different organizations, we don't have competing events, and we're all able to pull as a community to do the best amount of good. So I hope that some of you have seen this flyer around, which is hopefully how you came to this talk. Simultaneously today, we were doing a one meal for Haiti, where you can either fast or eat, but give what you would have spent on a meal to Haiti, because they are so desperately in need of food with food security issues. We're going to have a bunch of events coming up, but basically we're going to be this entire term planning strategic events to try and both memorialize Haiti, create awareness, and raise funds. So anyone and everyone is welcome to participate in that planning process.
I'll just speak a little bit personally about, in addition to what Remley said with our organization as a student body moving forward, I personally will probably like my intention going into this winter intersession trip was to use this data towards a capstone. And now I think a lot of the focus on Haiti is not on long-term things in terms of iodine deficiency anyway. And somehow that stirs in me like a need to kind of like stick to the plan more so, because this issue has less advocates. And so even though I have an incomplete data set as the way things stand now, I think this area needs a lot more work, and so, you know, I guess it's just one more thing to address in terms of development there.
Okay. There was one, if you will, plant in the audience, a group from Homewood. I think Isabella Pereira, but she can't be here. Mike Rogers would like to talk about some of the initiatives that the Homewood students are doing. So we have the floor for either come up or just speak from there.
Everyone hear me? Yeah. What we've been trying to do is actually very similar to what Melanie is describing. And we, you know, in the days following the earthquake, we kind of tried to put together a coalition of student groups to get together both to maintain awareness long term about what's going on, not just the acute phase response, and also to raise funds. And the way we approach doing that is to try to host, coordinate a series of strategic events with groups on the Homewood campus, and then also raise awareness about the individual efforts of separate groups, because the undergraduate population of 4,500 is just there's a lot of momentum moving in different directions, and we've kind of been trying to centralize it. So as of now, we have a coalition of over 70 student groups, and some, I think, 300 or so individuals have signed up to take part in this. We had a campus-wide meeting last week in which over 130 people showed up to plan kind of a February kickoff event for Homewood relief efforts. And on Saturday, February 20th, we're going to be having a day-long series of events to raise funds and awareness. And we're still in the planning process because it's coming up so close, there's some logistical issues, but we're committing, for the rest of the term and beyond to working on this, and we'd love to work together on anything we can.
Yeah, I went to that meeting. It was very impressive.
So I'd just like to say, I do have to run to class, but if anyone wants to, get the bus first, but if anyone wants any information, you can email us. It's very simple, jhu88@gmail.com, or I'm sure someone can find a way to get in touch with me for the emails that are going on. So thank you very much, and thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mike. And then just before we get to sort of individual Q&A or comments, is there anyone else here representing an initiative of some sort on behalf of a student group? I know there were some nursing students, some med school students who were organizing things. If any of you are out there in the audience and would like to have a comment, going once, going twice. Okay, if not, then maybe the floor is open for any additional questions to our panelists, comments on Haiti, reflections on what we individually or as a school need to be thinking about going forward. Yes?
I just have a comment.
Can you just introduce yourself? Sorry, just make it more personal.
My name is Josie Sisco, and I'm an MPH student at Hopkins, and my boyfriend is Haitian, and his mother has 13 brothers and sisters, of which most of them are Haiti, but miraculously all of them who were in the area near the earthquake survived without any injury. So my comment is that for people living in Haiti right now, life is obviously going to be even harder than what it was before. And I know personally with my boyfriend's mom, she's filing papers to bring some of her nieces and nephews to the U.S. to raise in the meantime. And I guess I was just wondering what you guys think about that and how easy it would be for, for that, for people immigrating from Haiti into the U.S. at least temporarily.
I've got a comment on that if you want to field that. I guess sort of being the resident migration person. As you may or may not know, the U.S. government, the Obama administration, has offered what's called temporary protected status to all Haitians living in the United States, no matter what their legal or undocumented status may be. There are about 530,000 Haitian immigrants in the United States, living mainly in Miami and Florida, but all along the East Coast primarily. Of those, perhaps 100 to 200,000 may be in undocumented status. TPS is a category that the government can grant for a indefinite period to allow persons to remain, as it were, protected in the United States so that they are not being forced by deportation laws or other circumstances to return to a country, in this case affected by natural disaster. In other contexts, it can be protecting people, Guatemalans, Salvadorans, from return to countries in conflict. Now that is for Haitians who are here. And that provides a sort of temporary cover of protection and opportunity to work. So it's not just simply allowed to remain, but to have opportunity to work and enjoy work, have work permits and other access to services. The more particular question is, what could or should the United States government or other governments do to facilitate migration out of Haiti for people who are in country but need to leave either for purposes of family reunification, humanitarian assistance, or maybe medical conditions that may not be possible to treat or may be more effectively treated here. I don't think there's a definitive answer. There is a debate as to whether the U.S. should open migration channels. There has been expedited adoption. And I think there was a story in the Sun about a case of a family who's been waiting for adoption of a Haitian child. There are also problems. You may hear about the 10 Baptist missionaries who are now on trial for child trafficking for having attempted to take 33 children out of the country without passports, without documents. Their argument was these children needed help. They needed to be settled someplace else. The families were even willing to give them to us, but absent proper paperwork, there is a very real concern that this kind of thing could lead to potential abuse of the children. So my thought would be, and one of the things that we can think about as a school going forward, is not just the relief, not just not losing sight, as Andrew said, of the ongoing public health concerns, the long-term development issues like addressing the issue of iodine deficiency, but also to try to understand the migration dynamics, not just those who are displaced temporarily outside of Port-au-Prince, a huge issue. How will they be housed for probably upwards of several years? Where will they find work? This is not just put them in tents, get some more water and food for the next few weeks. This is a massive displacement and temporary housing effort. Deal with the issue of people who are already displaced or migrating outside their country. 2 million Haitians are outside of their country, mostly in the Dominican Republic. That's a major brain drain. It's not all high-skilled, it's often low-skilled. But to also promote the idea of how do we, as a country, respond, in this case, to the humanitarian needs of families to migrate, to reunite, and to facilitate and open up some migration channels. I don't know that there's a clear answer. It's not necessarily a refugee category because they're not being persecuted, but it may be an externally displaced persons kind of a category. And there are some conversations going on, and I hope that we can be part of that as a school.
The other thing is that the organization that we're fundraising for is called Beyond Borders, and it initially we're putting our money towards the Model Villages program because we are interested in long-term sustainable development, and that program grew out of something called the Campaign to End Child Servitude. They have this big issue about rest of X, which is basically when a slightly poorer family, a very poor family, sends their child to a slightly richer family in the idea that they'll get education, but what they normally get is basically slavery. And so this program is looking to build villages that have comprehensive economic platforms and good schools so that parents can afford to keep their children and think there are good opportunities there. So I think that promoting development, not just in Port-au-Prince, but in all the provinces, to be able to accept new people is really important. So the latest stats up on the UN website are that about 450,000 people have migrated out of Port-au-Prince back to the provinces. But they left the provinces in the first place because there wasn't the infrastructure to support them there. So I think it's incredibly important while the iron is hot, while money is being doled out in the next 3 months before people have fatigue, to be placing money in long-term items as well as short-term items, and in strengthening the provinces as well as strengthening Port-au-Prince.
Yes. Sorry, I wasn't keeping track of order. It was just, that's where my eyes landed. Forgive me if I had somebody else I didn't catch.
My name is Adnan, I'm a PhD student. I just had a question. How did you guys keep yourselves mentally with it in the face of seeing what you did? I think some of you guys mentioned that you blocked some of what you did and blocked emotionally what you were doing. But how you kept yourself driven without sleep and probably not enough food, and then even now how you're dealing with it?
I guess it was kind of easy for me because of my doctor training, so we always have to block out the emotional part of it. But as far as sleep, I think we slept okay, 7 to 8 hours a day, though we slept outside and there were aftershocks, but seriously, it was nothing. And food, we had energy bars, and we got to eat about twice a day. So yeah, it was okay.
Anyone else? Okay, another question here? Yeah.
I just wanted to say that hearing
Oh, no,
the
wait,
story-
sorry. Here was first, and then you're second. Sorry.
My name is Bernadette, and I have the question is, Haiti obviously had such poor infrastructure to begin with, and now there's been talk that this might be an opportunity to kind of start over in a way in building new infrastructure. How does that start? Who comes to the table to kind of help in building that infrastructure? And then kind of what are the kind of things that need to kind of come into place? How could that even unfold, I guess?
I've heard this question on the radio just last night, actually. I think a lot of people are asking that question, and the various responses that I've heard in different, just because I keep watching all the blogs, is just that like both the Haitian intellectuals that are left and the Haitian diaspora, which is huge, where a lot of the intellectuals are probably going to be directing a lot of the long-term development. But of course, the people holding the money and all the aid agencies, there's a lot more collaboration and communication going on. The USAID was having phone calls daily at 4 p.m. if anybody wants to join on coordinating the NGO response. There's sectors within the city, and so I think a lot of the long-term stuff. There's going to be huge. The U.S. government's already sponsored a long-term conference in New York coming up. So I don't know, but I think the aid community is going to try to pull in a lot of Haitian intellectuals and leadership. That's my hope.
Well said. We had one here, and then.
I just wanted to say, as my family is Haitian, and this topic has been very hard for me, but I'm so proud of the work that you guys did, and really, I just feel privileged to be your classmate, and that's it.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Dana?
I'm wondering, I may have realized there were 7 fault lines. With that knowledge, if Haiti did have an emergency preparedness plan at all, and what that looked like, and then what the response was in terms of following the plan and how it panned out, if you guys can speak either from your experience or Professor, if you can speak to any formalities that did exist.
Are you aware of
I'm unaware of any emergency preparedness plan. I think one of the things that was said was that it wasn't just tragic because so many buildings were lost. You know, like somebody outlined them for us one day after the earthquake. The Department of Health, the Department of Labor, the police, the main police station, the entire UN building, all the doctors at boardings, hospitals. Like you just outline them, and everything collapsed. But that it was such a large piece of such a small pie, and that there really wasn't a lot of infrastructure. So I don't know. Do you know if there was a?
I would maybe defer to Gilbert on this. My guess would be that there either wasn't one, or it wasn't up to date, or if they had it, and this is true for lots of other countries like, say, United States of America post-Katrina, that they couldn't find it, or this agency's plan wasn't quite the other agency's plan, and it fit earthquakes but only up to Category 3, and this was a 4. So really, I think and correct me if I'm wrong, I suspect that whatever they had was not particularly operational or even really operative at the time. And I suspect, along with many other conversations, is going to be all of these things, like what could we have done differently, better, how do we build back with better resilience for buildings and people, but also how do we put in place some of these preparedness plans and practice them so that in the event, because it will happen again, whether it's hurricanes or floods or something, earthquakes, disasters will happen. We just don't know when, but we can prepare for their eventuality. Gilbert, do you want to offer any other?
The other thing important about plans, and I think you said it very well, is it also takes people who are fully functional to implement them. And that's, I think, where the situation fell apart. And the UN, which has this kind of capacity, was also grievously damaged right from the top down. So I think the human resources as well as the plans components that's more there.
On day 2, we actually talked to a UN platoon, and in this particular regiment of 70 people, 3 people showed up for work, between people who had been crushed and were trapped and people who were trying to dig them out.
I know we're running a little late. Classes do start punctually around here. Maybe we can do one more, and then I think we're going to have to end it. People can stay on and talk, but I think we'll need to bring it to sort of a formal close.
I'm Tomo from Japan, and I'm wondering if you have seen any political or diplomatic barrier for humanitarian support. So I was in charge of deploying some support 2 years ago when there was a huge earthquake in China, deploying some self-defense for the military troops from Japan, but the Chinese government didn't want any troops from Japan to be there. So did you see any such political diplomatic difficulties?
I think the question is about like were there any political issues about bringing in aid groups, right? So actually they were pretty accepting of any. There were a lot of foreigners in there. There were Belgian teams, Chinese teams, American teams, Russians.
Yeah, we had heard about some sort of like back and forth push and pull controversies or issues at the Dominican border with, you know, like it being open for a day and then like I think subsequently closed, but I don't really, I can't say like in general on the ground in Port-au-Prince there was any of that we detected.
I think there were some issues at the Dominican Republic border because of some ongoing tensions. There was a brief issue with whether China would send teams because Haiti was one of the few governments that recognizes Taiwan as a state. But I think they ironed that out, and I'd like to believe anyway, that there are Taiwanese or China, Taiwan, and PRC teams operating together. So on that, let's say, hopeful note, let's thank the panel again so much for their... There is much work to be done. I can pledge on behalf of our center that we will try as best we can to help kind of coordinate and motivate and stimulate and tag along with this great enthusiasm that you all have and the real commitment that you've shown. Thank you all for coming. Do be in touch. There's some brochures in the back of organizations or initiatives if you want to grab something as you go out. But I know we'll be in touch with you through the HHC or other mechanisms. And thanks again to the MPH office for putting you in harm's way.